Hi, my name's Rachel Muggleton. I'm a 25-year-old girl from upstate New York in the United States of America. And prior to my encephalitis story, I was a typical sophomore in college. I was studying pre-med biology, kind of immersing myself in college as you usually do, joining clubs, making friends, really kind of at the peak of my experience. And that's when COVID kind of happened. My story is very interesting. It kind of has a twofold of both the tragedy of encephalitis as well as a pandemic going on in the world, which is kind of hopefully something that could never happen again at the same time. But it does definitely call into question, how healthcare providers have to step up into those family and friend roles since I was in isolation. So, about spring of my sophomore year of college, I was sent home because of COVID, and we were studying at home online. And I started to kind of act different. My parents noticed that I wasn't really making a lot of sense. I stopped, being able to perform normal daily tasks. I would make my bed, but only maybe halfway. If I were trying to go to bed, I would be really scared. I often would ask my mom to sleep with me. I was just really paranoid about something bad happening. I would often say I was scared I was going to fail my finals. I was scared I was going to fail out of college, like very irrational fears. My family doesn't have a medical background, so to them it just was maybe stress. They kind of brushed it off as, maybe she's stressed about finals. We've never seen her prepare. And then within about 7 days, I rapidly became catatonic. I started not really forming sentences anymore. I wouldn't recognize my brother at dinner. And then eventually I started having unrelenting seizures. And that's when my family decided to take me to the emergency department. And at that point, they weren't really quite sure what was wrong with me, especially because I was at a really small community hospital. Um, they thought maybe I had some psychiatric issues, maybe schizophrenia or something of the sorts, as I was also hallucinating and having a lot of just like distorted realities. I was also pretty aggressive. So they actually started putting me on like a psychiatric routine in the ED. So they gave me antipsychotics and a lot of meds like that that actually made me worse. I started to progress even further. I was still having these seizures. And then eventually they decided to send me off to a higher hospital of care in my area. So when I went up there, they did my spinal tap and realized that I had anti-NMDAR autoimmune encephalitis, a diagnosis that my neuroimmunologist at the time had only seen about twice before in his medical career. And also, as we know, a very new diagnosis to the medical world, having it been founded in about 2007. So there's not really a perfect treatment or protocol, which is very scary to providers, as we know, for a lot of different types of encephalitis. It is kind of trial and error and seeing what works for each patient. I, of course, had the benefit of being treated very early. It was about within 7 to 10 days of my onset of symptoms, I would say, that I was seen in the hospital, which, as we know, is very crucial in recovery for people with encephalitis. So when I got to the hospital, my family followed the emergency ambulance up there, but like I said, because of the pandemic, they weren't allowed into the hospital. And they actually weren't allowed into the hospital for the first about month and a half I was there, which was very hard, especially because they didn't know what was wrong with me for the first couple days I was there until the results from the spinal tap came back. So while I was there, I was first placed into the neuro ICU and I was put into a medically induced coma. My seizures were so bad that they couldn't try to quell them with typical like ketamine and the therapies that they had seen had worked before. So they put me into a pentobarbital coma for about 3 months. At about 3 months, they tried to wake me back up to see if my seizures were a little less or if they could be managed. And they weren't. So they put me back into the coma for another month and a half, so about 4.5 months in total. Um, and then that's when they woke me up. I started to to not have seizures as much. And throughout my whole process, I had a huge combination of IVIG, plasmapheresis, rituximab, um, in some other chemotherapies, I believe. And so when they woke me up, they decided to bring me down to the inpatient rehab floor because I had a lot of work to do. And as we know, with brain inflammation, you kind of have to relearn everything from the beginning. So I came in to the hospital as a pre-med 20-year-old from undergrad and essentially woke up from my coma as like a kindergarten level intellectual capability and especially like daily activity capability. I had to relearn how to walk, how to talk. I was intubated, so I had to relearn how to swallow, how to breathe on my own. I had a feeding tube, so introducing foods again, um, strength, my mental status. I had to completely learn how to write, read, and the inpatient therapy there was absolutely crucial, as well as like I can't emphasize enough how patient-centered my care was. My providers basically had to be my family and friends because of COVID. I didn't have visitors. I didn't have people for a very long time. My family was eventually allowed to visit, but not until about a month and a half. And even then, it was only my parents that could come. My siblings couldn't come. My friends couldn't come. So my providers really had to step into that role, and they did an amazing job. Any letter that was sent to me, they read to me every day. They would post the pictures up in my ICU room. They would remind me of who people were every day, tell me stories about what was happening in the world. And even though I probably couldn't understand or remember it, it was the time that they spent out of their day that they didn't have to that I truly think helped me recover. Um, because I am a very extroverted person, and I think a lot of my recovery relies on, companionship. And I am incredibly grateful that the providers that I had inpatient really stepped up to that role. And so eventually, after about a month and a half of inpatient rehab work, I was finally discharged in October. Yeah, I started in May, so it was about May to October in the hospital here, and I was discharged to go home, but on a very strict. I had occupational therapy, I had physical therapy, I had speech therapy. I still was using a walker at that point, so I still had to do a lot of home strength exercises. I found like for cognition, I kind of started really early, just to try to combat the things that I could as early as I could. So I would have people read to me before I could read. I would have just people read to me, try to reintroduce words. If I didn't know a word, I would say, can you tell me what that word means? Can you use it in a sentence for me? Um, I would go to the library and I would get kind of workbooks. I would get like the kindergarten workbook. And then once I got through the kindergarten workbook, I would go to first grade and then kind of just seeing what levels I was capable of doing. And it's amazing how plastic the mind is and how much once you kind of start digging at it, it really starts to mold again. Because I remember my biggest fear, as I'm sure a lot of our biggest fears, because a lot of these illnesses affect such young people at their peak of education or their peak of career, or their not even peak, sorry, their pursuit to their peak, which is startling and really hard to ever recover from. And I know, especially mentally for me, it was hard to kind of wrap my head around ever getting back to my baseline, let alone overcoming my baseline. And yeah, the mind, once you start working at it, really kind of starts bringing things back in. And I remember my neuroimmunologist was like, "Oh, one day you'll wake up and you'll remember your iPhone password." Because I remember I wasn't allowed to have technology for a while as I was recovering because I obviously didn't know how to use it properly. And I really wanted to have my phone back. And no one knew my password. And my neuroimmunologist was like, "One day you'll wake up and it'll come to you." And I was like, that's impossible. How would I ever have these numbers just come to me? And sure enough, as I kept working through these workbooks and really working my mind, like one day I just typed in my password and it worked. Um, Not to say that there's a magic key for every problem that we have in recovery, but I really think just as much as you work on it, it kind of rewards you. And it's a slow, painful process. And I think hard it is as it is on your own body, it is mentally as well. And it's a very like dark place to be, knowing what you used to be and seeing yourself now, especially like being in your 20s. But I think what helped me get through it was how hard everyone has worked to get me to this point, and now it's kind of my turn finally. You have a lot of or at least I felt I had a lot of these involuntary things happen to me. I had this illness that I felt like I couldn't control. I felt like I had these timelines that I had to meet that I couldn't control, and then finally it was up to me, and I had the strength to do it. And that's what really helped me motivate keeping going and trying to get back to school and all of that stuff. Because my end goal was, I always wanted to be a physician. I still want to be a physician, regardless of, this turbulent story and journey that I had to go on. And like now more than ever, I wanted to be one. So how can I be one? And what people do I have to talk to get back to that level? So I worked really well with my college. I started to take community college classes eventually after graduating from outpatient rehab, and slowly started to get back into my college credits, and actually graduated only a semester later than I was supposed to after missing my entire junior year of college. Um, and I went on to go back to the hospital that treated me and shadowed in the neuro ICU for almost all of my Christmas break, my senior year of college, which was so inspiring and so cool to see, the other side of things. It was, of course, insanely emotionally driven, and I learned so much about how that process works and honestly how quiet a neuro ICU floor can really be. But it was definitely full circle and something that I felt really healed me and gave me closure, as well as kind of ignited a flame in me to continue on my path of being a physician. And I think post encephalitis, I had a lot of questions. Obviously, it's a very confusing diagnosis, especially because there isn't really a known cause. Of course, there's a connection to the ovarian teratoma that we know about, which in my story, they did end up taking out one of my ovaries. Just they thought they'd seen something on imaging. They were really hopeful. They were hoping that this would be, the one thing that would help me recover. But it ended up being benign. There was nothing really in the ovary. So I remember that was really hard for my physicians because that meant there was no definitive plan for them to go towards. They kind of had to rework that. But so it was a lot of like learning that stuff. So I was finally at outpatient. I was at a level of graduating rehab, and then it was kind of like, okay, what happened to me? How much can I understand? Because when you're discharged and you're at a level of a kindergartner, second grader, there's only so much they can tell you and so much that you can understand and really like swallow. So it was a gradual process of even like kind of learning what had happened to me, because it affects your cognition so much. And still I feel like I learn a little bit every day about my journey. And as far as now, I think I mean, my experience, not that I would have ever wanted to have gone through it, is so invaluable to my career as becoming a physician. I think I see these really, really hard clinical stories, especially when it comes to pediatric cases or cases of younger children that, the whole family is involved. And it truly is this heart of the family, and everybody feels like they're as equally affected as this illness. And I feel like now I kind of have some insight to just be like, I know it feels like there will never be light at the end of this tunnel. I know it feels like you got struck with the most unlucky stick in the entire world, but you can get through it. I got through it. I didn't think I'd ever be here again. I was shocked if I'd ever go back to college. And I think just being able to sit down and be like, I've been there. I know how scary it is. Let's kind of work through this together. Uh, I just feel so much comfort going into my career, having that in my pocket and just knowing that hopefully I can give comfort the way that I was given when I was in the hospital. So yeah, I think a lot of it is good. I love using, I was given this involuntary circumstance. And I think when you are given something like this in life, you have two choices. You can either, sit and wallow in self-pity and be, why me, why me, why me? And I'm not gonna lie and say that wasn't me for a very long time. I was in my 20s and I wanted to live my 20s and I couldn't. So I was very angry, why me, why me, why me, for probably months, if not a year post recovery. But it gets to a point where you have to say, one, I'm never going to fully recover if I'm always in this state of confusion and anger and so much, angst towards this situation, because there are questions that will never be answered. That is life and that is medicine and that is science. And we have to be okay with not knowing, as frustrating as that is, especially as, people that like to know things and have control over things. But it has to be, you have to be okay with not knowing, and you have to be okay with saying, it was me. I don't know why. And we got to move on. We got to just wake up today and be like, but thank God it was me that recovered. If it was me, thank God I'm here and I could get through it. And then you have to pick, after the self-pity and why me, how do I do good from this? How do I bring change from this? Because I'm not going to let something happen to me and affect me so deeply and then not use it for good. That's not the purpose of why these things, or at least why I believe these things happen in life. So yeah, it's kind of been my journey ever since. How do I integrate this into my life for good and for positivity and change? And I'm really fortunate to be in medicine where awareness on these topics is crucial. As we know, encephalitis is not talked about enough. The subtypes of it are not researched enough. They're not funded enough. They're not, a lot of my neuro ICU team had never even heard of anti-NMDAR autoimmune encephalitis. I can say from my medical education, I've read on it once. I've had one question on it in totality of any exam, quiz, anything I've ever taken. Um, a lot of my classmates don't know about it if it wasn't for me and my personal story. And and it all goes back to that day in the ED where they were quick to say, oh, a 20-year-old who's hallucinating and having these weird thoughts, it must be psychiatric, it must be schizophrenia, quick diagnosis. And that's where awareness is key. Had this been talked about enough, had this been educated enough in their medical background, this would have been in their back of their mind as a differential. Okay, we have schizophrenia, but she could also have encephalitis. She could have, autoimmune encephalitis, what type, those types of things, but that only comes with awareness and education and conversations. And I feel like I've made it really kind of my part, whether people around me find it annoying or not. I'm constantly talking about it. I'm constantly looking at new research about it. I'm constantly, making every attending I'm with aware, whether they're ever going to be in a neuro situation or not, because it's important to me, and it changed my life. And I was lucky enough to get treated really early and get told, this isn't a correct diagnosis. You need to go see somebody else. But as we know, people are not as lucky. And some people never recover because of misdiagnosis. So yeah, I feel like my journey has been a lot of ups and downs. It's been a roller coaster of emotions and how I perceive this whole situation. And of course, that comes with maturity and growing and stuff like that. But I think I'm finally at a really good point where, I can talk about it without crying. I use it as motivation and fuel rather than keeping me blanketed and keeping me down and sheltered. And I think once I finally transitioned from that was where I really felt closure from my diagnosis.